Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Cosmin and Freya, for inviting me over. Just a bit of a disclaimer, I'm not actually a curator. I haven't curated like anything for more than 5 years, so I wouldn't call myself one out of embarrassment. What else do I want to say? So what I'm going to focus on today, there are 2 solo exhibitions of Reza Piyadasa, an artist, that are of primary concern for me here. And they were held 1 year apart, one of which was an MFA graduating exhibition staged at the University of Hawaii, Manoa in 1977, and the second one, a homecoming exhibition that further expanded on the premise resulting from an extensive conversation with art historian T.K. Sabapati in 1978, held at the University Science Malaysia in Penang, where Piyadasa was subsequently appointed as a senior lecturer in the art department. So when I was asked to speak on the topic of exhibition as a tool for writing history by Freya and Cosmin, I wanted to tilt the focus of this given topic to address the question of historiography, or the way in which history is being written. More specifically, I returned to 1977 and 78 in order to examine an instance in which the contemporary art exhibition as a form contributed to a different model of writing art history. But what are we trying to recover from this particular mode of address and discourse? So let me say from the outset that I sometimes feel that the conventional grammar of exhibition today, as permissive as it has developed over the course of the 20th century, its over-reliance on the spatialization of ideas or knowledge in order to engender a form of engagement with the public has already, in some ways, exhausted its use. This is perhaps something we can discuss later on. Nevertheless, perhaps the search for an impulse that could be termed exhibitionary is still productive to think about and might invite us to seek out less a format of display than a philosophical framework or attitude, and more of a posture or a venture, a desire or a way of comprehending the world that might survive in other cultural forms and platforms by which ideas and knowledge are communicated and shared. So let us go back to our recent past to recover from what I mean by the term exhibitionary. It is not possible to speak of the 2 exhibitions that I wanted to highlight without a cursory mention of preceding events in Malaysia, 2 of which are, I think, seminal. So in 1974, Reza Piyadasa, together with another artist, Sulaiman Esa, put together what they called a jointly initiated experience with the title Towards a Mystical Reality. The exhibition featured largely found objects displayed on pedestals at an exhibition space called the Writer's Corner at the National Language Institute in Kuala Lumpur. So each displayed object was matched to a title. The titles are intimation of a specific event. Take the clump of hair you see at the bottom right corner of the slide. It is titled Randomly Collected Sample of Human Hair Collected from a Barber Shop in Petaling Jaya. Or the bird cage on the lower left corner, which is titled Empty Bird Cage, after release of bird at 2:46 p.m. on Monday, 10th June 1974. Accompanying the exhibition was a 30-page manifesto which called for a paradigmatic reevaluation of reality towards what was termed the mystical, in which it was then assumed that this Eastern paradigm, seen through the lens of Zen Buddhism, offered a conception of time and a perceptual mode different to that of the West, one that is less strictly linear and progressive. Yet for all its simplistic conflation of the East as constituting a sort of Zen mean time, the aestheticization of everyday objects and detritus taken from events outside of the gallery space, and the downplaying of artistic identity through collaboration, and the search for a local vernacular rooted in the now, are signposts of certain methodological impulses that would continue to drive Piyadasa's conceptual art explorations of 1977 and 1978. The second exhibition that needs to be highlighted as preceding what I want to talk about is a survey of Malaysian sculpture curated by Singaporean art historian T.K. Sabapati, who was not only then lecturing at the University Science Malaysia in Penang, he would subsequently play the role of Piyadasa's intellectual collaborator for his 1978 exhibition in Penang. In the catalogue essay for the 1976 exhibition on sculpture, Sabapati advanced two trending tendencies in Malaysian sculpture, which he termed vitalist and constructivist, even if by admission the latter was smaller in numbers. So even if, as he did not consider towards a mystical reality within the category of works that were brought together as Malaysian sculpture, Sabapati cited a passage from the manifesto written by Piyadasa and Sulaiman Esa that prospected the, quote, many dimensions of reality, unquote, in order to suggest that sculpture offers a way to engage with a prevailing feature of mainstream modernism, which he defines as, and I quote him again, the embracing nature of its aesthetic, which effectively removed the traditional distinctions between two-dimensional and three-dimensional art forms, unquote. It is strange that such a definition of modernism is advanced, since common perception in the mainstream is predicated on the notion of medium specificity and structural transparency. Then again, a large number of scholarship and exhibitions that have emerged over the last 2 decades, such as MoMA's Inventing Abstraction 1910 to 1925, has re-evaluated earlier boundaries to touch on the interdisciplinarity and interpenetrability of modernism, a feature that is no longer regarded as the special purchase of the postmodern or the contemporary. In a sense, sculpture in Malaysia had reached an impasse. On the one hand, the shift towards an exploration of the real as a cipher for an encounter with the prosaic, temporal occurrences outside of the gallery space diffuses aesthetic consideration into different philosophical and conceptual paradigm, as with towards a mystical reality. On the other, the conventional form of sculpture as structurally mapped out as embodying formalist features of being either vitalist or constructivist, such as in T.K. Sabapati's exhibition, thereby forecloses plastic potential within the structuralist or the binary. These conditions are unlike the generative map that Rosalind Krauss would put together using the Klein group diagram that most of us are familiar with in her essay Sculpture as an Expanded Field, written in 1979. So because of this, the search for a kind of dialectic resolution out of the above impasse was very much in the mind of Piyadasa when he enrolled in the 2-year MFA program at the University of Hawaii in 1975. Though he initially chose the University of Hawaii with the intention of studying art history, specifically to focus on Asian art history, he was instead persuaded to take up an MFA with a major in sculpture. With the provision, he was able to take as many art history courses as he liked, short of a major. In 1977, for his graduating thesis, for his graduating exhibition, Reza Piyadasa presented a number of outdoor sculptural works using shadow as a conceptual medium in order to comment on the temporal character of art making and the writing of art history. Piyadasa subsequently expanded the premise of this exhibition in the following year, after his return to Malaysia. The format of both shows evinces a desire to situate the work outside of the context of the white cube. A significant component of the works featured in both the 1977 and 1978 exhibition were displayed outdoors. In these sculptural works, sunlight as a source of lighting was not only there to register the passing of time, like a sundial. The sun also introduced a destabilizing feature to the artwork, since the outline resembling shadow cast by the found objects was also painted on the platform of the artwork themselves. The viewers therefore see two overlapping shadows at times on the sculptural platform, one real and the other painted. Complementing or perhaps disrupting the visual game are texts in the form of statements and questions that might direct viewers' attention towards other philosophical inquiries. So even for those sculptural works that were shown indoors, such as this work up here, Piyadasa experimented heavily with lighting. Clearly, shadow was a significant element in these sculptural works. Reflecting on this matter in a later interview, Piyadasa notes, and I quote him, One day at the university, I was looking at long dark shadows cast by trees and by the people walking in the square. I was suddenly very conscious of people's shadows rather than of the people. I realized that these shadows are particular parts of any situation. When you have these physical things in space, in light, then you're going to have shadows as well. So many of these art situations that I developed, and by art situation here he was referring to his artworks, many of these art situations that I developed began by dealing with shadow and time, lengthening, shortening, and so on, a suggested situational kind of motion in time, unquote. So take A Matter of Time, 1977 as an example. A painted shadow of the chair is overlaid with the actual shadow, which moves according to the position of the sun throughout the day, and perhaps disappears when the sun is shaded by cloud or come nightfall. Much has been said about the reference to Joseph Kosuth's own use of the chair as a semiological trope. Therefore, it is not worth repeating here. What is crucial to point out is the interplay of a variety of elements within this work, sustained by a tension that produces a crisis of meaning. Observe how the textual statement invites us to consider the near-nonsensical Zen-like koan about Chinese artists refusing to, quote, to halt reality in a single instance of time, unquote. This is juxtaposed with the found object in the form of a chair that is then given a false shadow to introduce a sense of instability in the viewer's perception of the object as it overlays the actual shadow cast by the sun. The shadow in these instances is perhaps a stand-in for positionalities that are held out in unresolved tension. This tension is replicated in the object, text, and shadow artwork arrangement that resulted in works that were never quite conclusive. In Piyadasa's own master's thesis, he would note the following, I quote him, "I have in many instances tried to incorporate the principles of double signified in some of my works. I'm quite simply trying to communicate facts rather than symbols for the viewers to decipher for himself. It is essentially an open-ended statement that does not presuppose the celebration of any particular aesthetic value judgment," unquote. And looking back on the subject, Piyadasa had this to further add. So these oppositional kinds of situations began to attract me. The viewers now had to decode, try to find and understand, make something out of themselves of the situation that I have set up, unquote. What are these situations provoking? How does that then inform one's position in time and the relationship between the now and that temporal unfolding that we call art history? In many ways, I believe that both the exhibitions reflect Reza Piyadasa's abiding interest in art history and the questions that he had pertaining to art historiography, informed by his artistic direction as a sculptor. It became obvious that reading George Kubler's The Shape of Time influenced Piyadasa quite a bit. This spurred Piyadasa to explore how the exhibition form could be transformed into a vehicle of historiographic reflexivity. The outdoor exhibition enabled the use of shadow that became an important conceptual medium, which signified the temporal and prompted specific inquiries into notions of artistic chronology, linearity, and entry points. In The Shape of Time, Kubler regarded the object less in terms of its material constitution than as a problem that occurred across time. This temporal chain through which we might detect the desire to come to grips with a problem provisionally constitute a series of linked solutions, depending on when the problem emerged at a particular historical moment. Therefore, if the problem was resolved over time, the form class can be identified as a closed series, while if it was elaborated under different circumstances, the form class becomes an open sequence, which might be reactivated as a new set of problems under an entirely different historical circumstances. Kubler's The Shape of Time holds many attraction. Not least, it does away with the investment of artistic genius, a view that has already been espoused by Piyadasa through the self-effacing strategy that he introduced as a jointly initiated experience with Sulaiman Esa in Towards a Mystical Reality. But central to Kubler's argument is also the notion of entrance and position, in which the history of things are understood as constituting a temporal chain. For Piyadasa, this was productively reframed in what is by now one of the most widely circulated piece of conceptual art statement from Southeast Asia, his 1978 artwork Entry Points, realized for the 1978 exhibition in Penang. The statement, "Artworks never exist in time, they have entry points," is not a direct quotation, but a paraphrase on the very strategy of entrance and position through which artworks gain cogency and historical significance, a la Kubler. For example, take the work that is mounted in this conceptual work itself, Entry Points. It is a 1958 painting by Nanyang-style painter Xiaoyu Weng titled River Scene. Are we to simply consider Yu Qian's art as falling stylistically under the category of a latter-day post-impressionism? If so, under what Michael Baxendale would call the sad term of influence, audience and scholars are then inclined to characterize this work as secondary or derivative. On the other hand, if the painting is understood through Kubler's notion of position and entrance, the contingency of its appearance within a socio-historical context engenders a different set of problems. It is also one that acknowledges artistic agency on the part of Yu Qian to master and adopt an existing language on his own terms to advance the sensibility of the tropics that scholars have now categorized as Nanyang Fengke. So what Kubler offered was a way of articulating a long-held suspicion that was egging towards a mystical reality into an art historical framework that is then conceptually demonstrated through entry points. So entry points is in many ways a conceptual manifesto for the exhibition that Piyadasa would curate the following year at the National Art Gallery in 1979. Again, with T.K. Sabapati, they would put together the first retrospective of Nanyang painters, attempting to define a school of art centered around the Nanyang Academy of Fine Art as a significant post-war movement within the history of Malaysian modern art. It was not, as Chinese art historian Michael Sullivan would have written about it earlier, solely a southward addendum to the Grand March that is the history of Chinese art. Nanyang was spurred on by a very different lens, one that spoke of networks of flow and context as constituting a story of migration and vision for homeland, twin to a renewed political stake in the new nation of Malaya, and later Malaysia, and still later Singapore. As an exhibition for a movement of post-war historical paintings, Piyadasa identified an art school founded in 1938 in Singapore as the genesis of a movement. However, the hang of the show, which I haven't been able to find pictures of, were in all probability quite conventional, but that is not the point here. The exhibition as a tool for writing history, in this instance, is imbricated to the phenomena of the artist turned curator. This necessitates an activation of exhibition as a form capable of narrating new historical sideline and also perhaps offer new model of writing this history. In this sense, the double shadows become larger metaphors of the exhibition form that might offer strategic ways of thinking, such as juxtapositioning, that produces sustained dynamic tension. It is also an approach to history that calls upon the past to a politics of the present. This impulse can, of course, take other forms. In this sense, Piyadasa was not the only one challenged to think this way by Kubler. We might productively compare it to American artist Robert Smithson in his experimental visual essays, Quasi, Infinities and the Waning Space of 1966 and The Ultramodern of 1967. For Smithson, reading Kubler engendered a crisis of temporality and pointed to a model of time whose contours were not wholly accessible to the presentness that the artist is inhabiting. As suggested by art historian Pamela Li, what the shape of times brings into relief is, and I quote her, the acutely contemporary phenomena of non-contemporaneity, of not being with the time, unquote. This is a disjunctive feature that is unlike the very notion of coevality as emphasized by other art historians on contemporary art, such as Terry Smith. Or if we were to look for historical precedents, we might be able to look at something like Warburg's board number 79, which is of his sort of unfinished opus on cultural history and the psychology of art, the Atlas Mnemosyne. While commonplace reading continued to frame the Atlas under Warburg's own abiding interest in the afterlife of the antiquities, what is striking about board number 79 was its focus on key questions about redemption on a near global scale through the juxtaposition of the ancient and the modern, the East and the West, photography and reproductions of images of paintings and things like that. This thematic points to a messianic tradition that was equally unsettling someone like Frankfurt School associate and cultural critic Walter Benjamin, leading the latter to formulate the by now well-known image of the angel of history, which has his face turned towards the past, yet blown into the future by the storm of progress. And this search for redemption calls for a specific kind of history sensitive to the dangers of political instrumentalization of history, and instead asks for a kind of redemptive politics, or as Benjamin would put in his thesis, I quote, to articulate what is past does not mean to recognize how it really was. It means to take control of memory as it flashes in a moment of danger, end quote. Piyadasa, entering the fray under very different historical circumstances. A race riot in 1969 in Malaysia left a deep psychic scar, resulting in a need to seek out a new explanatory grid for the present circumstances and a renewed cultural expression to match this urgent project. The need to find meaning was further matched by a post-colonial desire for the reconfiguring of the world on terms of one's own. In Piyadasa's two exhibitions, this crisis of temporality, a realization of the non-contemporaneity as brought about by the recognition of the shifting parameters and multiplicity of situations as signified by the shadows, enabled a temporal alterity through which the exhibition form as a tool for writing history was able to crystallize. For some other artists, such as Piyadasa's University of Hawaii classmate Laura Ruby, this was con job art, a formulaic process which she spells out as conceptual art's deception. She protested against this by producing this work on the left, which you see on the screen, as a counterpoint to Piyadasa's graduation show in 1977. And yet, for Piyadasa, the stakes were wholly different, crystallizing in the statement that he would formulate here in 1978. In doing so, the artist-turned-historian was also doubly transformed into a curator, a figure that could redirect our concern of needing to be with the time. By this, I mean the singular time defined according to the terms established by artistic canons and centers. In order to explore other sidelines and establish other linked solutions in characterizing a mode of narrating that could simultaneously master and append the syntax of art history towards the formation of a different body of knowledge. And this is not towards, I'm almost done. And this is not towards an alternative history which expands on existing canon and yet follow a long tried and tested historiographic framework. But this is in order to push for an authority altogether that introduces an epistemological rupture. The exhibitionary is therefore an attitude to history, as well as art history, which draws on contemporary art's strategic use of juxtapositioning in order to disrupt conventional historical narrative. It underscores a condition of non-contemporaneity, a non-coevalness, a refusal of parity. It points to the possibility of an authority to a history rooted in linear and progressivist ideals towards one that embraces other contradictory and unresolved conditions of man, or realities, mystical and modern, all the same. Thank you.